Good morning, everybody. It's Crafting Journey. What you're listening to is the closing arguments in the antifreeze case. They're doing the jury instructions right now, but as soon as they go to the closings, I will bring in that video live. If you're watching back on the replay, just say hashtag replay and leave me a comment. Let me know you stopped by. Hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. And share this with someone you think might enjoy watching something while we craft. I'll be diamond painting today during this video. So I'm going to be quiet and let you guys listen.
Your field, they give an opinion in that field. You should credibility, the facts upon which the opinion is based, and the reasons given for the opinion received to help you reach conclusion. However, you are not bound by any expert's opinion. In resolving conflicts in expert testimony, weigh the different experts' opinions against each other. Also consider the qualifications and the credibility of the experts and the facts supporting their opinions. Hypothetical questions. During the trial, witnesses were told to assume certain facts and then was asked for an opinion based upon that assumption. This is called a hypothetical question. The opinion does not establish the truth of the facts upon which it is based. Consider the opinion only if you believe the assumed facts upon which it is based have been proved. If you find that the facts stated in a hypothetical question have not been proved, then the opinion based upon those facts should not be given any weight. The credibility of witnesses. It is the duty of the jury to scrutinize and weigh the testimony of witnesses and to determine the effect of the evidence as a whole. You are the sole judges of the credibility, that is, the believability of the witnesses and of the weight to be given to their testimony. In your determination of credibility, you must avoid bias, conscious or unconscious, based upon the witness's race, national origin, religion, age, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, education, income level, or any other personal characteristics. In determining the credibility of each witness and the weight you give to the testimony of each witness, consider these factors: whether the witness had an interest or lack of interest in the result of this trial, the witness's conduct, appearance, or demeanor on the witness stand, the clearness or lack of clearness of the witness's recollections, the opportunity the witness had for observing and for knowing the matters the witness testified about, the reasonableness of the witness's testimony, the apparent intelligence of the witness, bias or prejudice, if any, has been shown, possible motives for falsifying testimony, and all other facts and circumstances during a trial which tend either to support or discredit the testimony. Then give to the testimony of each witness the weight you believe it should receive. There's no magic way for you to evaluate the testimony. Instead, you should use your common sense and experience. And in everyday life, you determine for yourself the reliability of things people say to you. You should do the same thing here. Defendant elects not to testify. A defendant in a criminal case has the absolute constitutional right not to testify. The defendant's decision not to testify must not be considered by you in any way and must not influence your verdict in any manner. Impeachment of witnesses, prior conviction, or juvenile adjudication. Evidence has been received that some of the witnesses in this trial have been convicted of crimes. This evidence was received solely because it bears upon the credibility of the witness. It must not be used for any other purpose. Impeachment of witness, character for truthfulness. Evidence has been received regarding a witness's character for truthfulness. You may consider this evidence in weighing the testimony and determining credibility. Closing arguments of counsel. Consider carefully the closing arguments of the attorneys, but their arguments and conclusions and opinions are not evidence. Draw your own conclusions from the evidence and decide upon your verdict according to the evidence under the instructions given to you by the court. I will stop now with my instructions. I will read a portion later. At this time, the attorneys will do their closing. And anytime you're ready, Ms. McNeil, you can do your closing argument.
Good morning, everyone. 2023, this year, is the 25th year stolen from Julie Jensen. Birthdays and Christmases and new school years and graduations, all taken from her. When a person dies, their family is devastated, their friends mourn them and remember them. And after all this time, Ruth Vorwald, the first witness, cried thinking of Julie and remembering her death. After all this time, we heard from Angela Martinelli, Kim Noble, Carrie Ashley, Eric and Laura Shore, Therese DeFazio, David and Sharon Naring. We saw the videos of Ted and Margaret Voigt, Marion Passetti. Many, many good and wonderful people have died tragic deaths, but not many people, after all this time, would have so many friends and neighbors coming forward to tell you about them, to tell you what a kind, loving, devoted person they were, as Julie Jensen was. And it matters in this case because, yes, it is possible that even a mother with young children might end her own life, but that is not the evidence in this case. The evidence we have is that Julie told Ted Voigt, Margaret Voigt, Therese DeFazio, and the defendant's own sister, Laura Coster, about her fears that the defendant would kill her. Julie took pictures of things that troubled her in the defendant's day planner and gave them to the police. So the evidence here is not evil murder or tragic suicide. It's murder or it's suicide plus something else. Somebody committed a ghastly crime here. Julie Jensen plotted for weeks and weeks, at least mid-October 1998, to kill herself with a substance undetectable at autopsy, to plant evidence with her friends and the police and even in the computer that her husband was responsible. Or Mark Jensen, who had tormented and punished and never forgiven his wife for years, found her replacement and then killed her. What a convenient suicide this was for Mark Jensen. Kelly Labonte wasn't just an affair. She was Julie's replacement. That happened, and it happened almost immediately, even without regard for appearances. The defendant didn't have to worry about losing custody of his kids or child support or alimony. How convenient. As an added bonus, he stood to gain $100,000 in the life insurance money. even if Julie's death was ruled a suicide. Julie's death was so convenient for the defendant that he couldn't even resist high-fiving his father after he got his house back from the police. He couldn't wait to throw away Julie's possessions to make room for Kelly. What excellent timing Julie's suicide was for the defendant. The timing was so good that she died before the kids got home on December 3rd, so the defendant didn't have to worry anymore about David's pleas for his mother. Now, this is hard to fathom, and it can be hard to wrap your head around the idea that a respectable member of society, a person with a great job, a nice house, 2 kids, a dog, a pool, an idyllic life, would poison his wife with ethylene glycol and then smother her to death. That's why Julie's affair and the years of harassment that followed matter, because it shows how the defendant felt about his wife. He hated her. What the defendant did to kill his wife is almost past understanding, except he hated her. For nearly all people whose marriages are falling apart, the answer is divorce, not murder. But the defendant hated Julie, and we can prove it. There's the email to his girlfriend. See it on the screen there? You can see the text of the email. Hey, can't forget about you. Can't, don't want to. I miss you. See the email you've seen repeatedly? This is the email to his wife with the pornographic images attached to it. That shows you what he felt about his wife and what he felt about his girlfriend. How he wanted his girlfriend, he had Julie's replacement. And for him, it didn't have to be a divorce because he hated his wife. And now I want to take a look at this harassment that we've shown you before. I just want to take a look at a few things. First of all, I want you to see the extent of it. There's just page after page after page in this exhibit that we showed you of the harassment. It just keeps going on and on and on of Julie tracking it. And remember, we showed you yesterday the page where she was told by the police, hey, you got to keep track of this. You got to help us. So if we take a look at this, we just see some examples of what's happening. This is the page we showed you where she was told by the police to keep track of things. And again, a few examples of the type of harassment that was happening. One of the things that Julie said is it always seemed like the person who was harassing them just was one step ahead. 12/19/95, photos left in truck at Ruther during David's Christmas program. That's quite a stalker there. Finding the truck at Ruther during a Christmas program. That's amazing. That stalker is one step ahead. And then if we just go further, we heard in the testimony too the nature of this harassment. It wasn't just the hang-up phone calls. They would happen at home, but also, according to the defendant, they would happen at his work. The leaving of the pornographic images, they would happen around the home, but also, according to the defendant, they would be left at his work, mailed to him sometimes, but often left on his vehicle at work. These pornographic images, penises and photos of oral sex, or what looked like a woman in position close to a penis, those harassing photos. And we see more examples of that. Several hang-up calls at Mark's office, talking about David finding a tape. Found videotape in front of Brick Ledger garage. Then hang-up calls asking how he liked the tape. In various office, soft, effeminate male voice referring to video. photo left on Mark's truck at office. And again, we're not going to go through all of this. It just keeps going. And we showed you this page repeatedly too, the new tactics, which led to the notation of these harassing emails. And we recovered these emails. These were from the zip disk. They were found in the defendant's home, saved on what we would use nowadays would be a USB drive, a thumb drive or a flash drive. But back in the day, it was these zip disks. And what was found on the zip disk is the email that we showed you with the attachments. And because it's the actual email and not a screenshot, that's how we can see it was from Mark Jensen to Mark Jensen, and he saved it, and he saved the images attached to it, and it was on those disks. I also showed you too that he saved some screenshots from a computer, and in the screenshots I showed you in the background, you could see Trading Expert Pro was up in the background. So you know it's from him. So we heard about Julie's hobbies, gardening and crafts and book club. This is the defendant's hobby. This is his hobby. This is what he did for years and years and years until, let's look when it stops. It trails off in June of 1998 and then ends entirely in August of 1998 when the defendant gets his girlfriend. Remember, Julie was alive for months afterwards, but there's no more notes in this harassment log because the defendant has a new hobby. The last thing I want to note about this, 6/19/98 definitely found Mark's new office phone number, ranted, raved, and swore at the receptionist, several hang-ups at the office after that. This was after Mark had moved to Stiefel Nicholas. We heard from the receptionist, Meredith Perez. She never got a call like this. Just more proof that this was fabrication. And think about the torment to Julie, because although Mark is reporting these things, who's at fault? It's her, because it's the man she had an affair with. And she has to tell the police about it. And when she tells the police about it, she has to repeat over and over and over again that she had an affair. And she even asked for one police officer, please, Pleasant Prairie, just send me one police officer so I don't have to tell the story again. We even have the defendant making Julie think the pictures were her. And if you saw this email, you saw how he would do it. In this email, the harasser is pretending that he's taking a picture without her knowing it of a married girl that he's currently doing. Just the kind of trickery that was used with Julie. The man she had an affair with must have taken secret pictures of her. And now these are pictures of her that he's leaving around. This is gaslighting. And Julie's a smart person, but she's just constantly being lied to and deceived by her husband. And she's told by the police and the private investigator, hey, we think it's your husband, but she doesn't want to believe it. Now, remember the defendant's interview. We showed you several clips from that recorded interview, not the greatest recording, 1998. But we showed you several clips from it, the defendant's own statements. And the defendant was confronted by Detective Ratzberg about this harassment. And what the defendant said, well, he said he'd find them around the house, these pictures, because he did. He'd find them around the house, but it was a question of showing them to her. He said he did end up showing a majority of them to her. And then here's what he said. How many times do you have to see pictures like that and get reminded of it before you kind of go, man, it's not worth it. It gets old and you put it away. And I'd put them away and then something would happen and I'd get pissed off and I'd pull some out and I'd say I found these in the shed. Then the question was, when in fact you had them? And Mark says, I had them. I mean, they'd accumulate for weeks. How many times do you have to see pictures like that? Who has an interest in exactly those kind of pictures? That's why this evidence matters, because Mark's obsession with these types of pictures, with these penis photos categorized on his computer, with photos of oral sex, this obsession was his, and those are exactly the harassing pictures that would be left around. And yet he acts to the detective like, oh, how many times you got to see it? He wants to see it. That's what he wants to look at, so we know it's him because of that too. And it's another lie to the detective. Remember how much Mark Jensen struggled when asked about Kelly Labonte? He just wouldn't say, even at the present moment, that she was his girlfriend. He, of course, wasn't going to admit to the affair before. But even in the present, he couldn't say she was his girlfriend. She had moved to Wisconsin at that time. She'd moved for him, but he wouldn't say it. So I said from the outset, the defendant was under no obligation to forgive Julie. If he had filed for divorce after the affair, you know what? Even if he did hate her forever after that, as long as he ended the relationship with divorce, then we wouldn't be here. But he never forgave her. That's what his friend from work, David Naring, said. That's what his friend noticed. Julie knew it too. It's one of the last things she said. She told Dr. Borman on December 1st about that affair and how she thought the defendant had never forgiven her. And that's not the only thing that Julie said on December 1st, because even though her marriage was falling apart and she was miserable, when she was asked about depression and whether she would ever kill herself, she said never. She would never leave her boys. And how many witnesses did we hear from in this case? It was a lot of witnesses. Not a single witness, not a single one testified that Julie Jensen ever made suicidal statements, that she ever had suicidal ideation, that she ever made a suicide attempt. Not a single one. Instead, what we can see in the evidence through the computer evidence is the timeline of the defendant's plot. That's why those emails with Kelly Labonte, the defendant, and Julie's day planner, their respective interests matter, because we can see the defendant's life reflected in those internet searches, that internet activity, and we simply do not see anything similar for Julie. Remember how dismissive Dr. Thomas was of Julie's lack of computer knowledge? You have to decide this case based on the evidence, not on cognitive bias, not on some make-believe story that's unsupported by the evidence. In contrast with the defendant, we have evidence that Julie Jensen was very unfamiliar with computers. That's the evidence. The very beginning of 1998. That's when she has that conversation with Therese DeFazio. Therese asked her about helping in the computer lab, and Julie said no. She was there to be helpful, but she just couldn't. She just didn't know about computers. And they joked about how slow she typed, 35 words a minute. Then we have Julie applying for the job at Bradford High School. Joe Mangi told you about that. Well, back in 1998, that job she was applying for, even for a high school, even an office in a high school, it wasn't a computer job. The secretaries at that time didn't even have computers. So Julie was very well qualified for that job. And when Julie had that conversation with Therese DeFazio about her being afraid the defendant was going to poison her, how she had seen the defendant on the computer, but he would turn it off or cover up the screen. Ms. DeFazio suggested, well, maybe she could look at the computer cache and maybe she could see what the defendant was up to. And Ms. DeFazio was familiar with a Macintosh, and so that's what she was suggesting. But Julie said she didn't know how to do that. She wouldn't know what to do. Ms. DeFazio even remembered David doing what kids do, right? They blurt something out about their mom. Oh, my mom doesn't know anything about computers. And it's funny, I'm teaching her. And it started a whole class discussion where all the other little kids joined in. And Ms. DeFazio explained, well, that was normal back then. Computers were just getting in the home in 1998. I am going to emphasize once again, you are to decide this case based on the evidence. So I am going to show you the evidence, and I'm going to go through that with you, because what I say or what they say, it doesn't matter if it's not supported by the evidence. So let's look at the timeline of the defendant's plan that we can see through the computer evidence. So we've seen this before, the dates and the times of this computer use. Now, the argument that you've heard from the defense is that, well, there's no computer use during normal work hours because Julie wouldn't have wanted to block the phone line. That argument is absurd and it's unsupported by the evidence, because not only is the internet on this home computer not used during normal work hours when the defendant wasn't home, but it also wasn't used at all when the defendant was out of town. So let's look at September. September 2nd. You zoom in. September 2nd, no internet activity. The defendant's in St. Louis. How do we know that? We have his day planner. We also have those emails. Here's the email from Kelly, September 3rd. Thanks again for yesterday. They were together in St. Louis on the 2nd. There's no internet activity on the 2nd. Let's go to later in September. We have another trip to St. Louis. We have computer activity, internet activity, the early morning hours of the 11th, but then the defendant goes to St. Louis that day, 11th and 12th. And again, how do we know it? It's right here in his day planner, and it's in the emails. Let's look at what Kelly had to say about that time frame. Her email, September 9th. She says on the bottom, a massage tomorrow and you the next day. How perfect can one life be? Tomorrow the 10th, the defendant the next day, the 11th. Let's go to October. The defendant and Kelly Labonte are in Appleton. No internet activity those days. This is the time period when the defendant and Kelly Labonte are going to Appleton. They're going to open up that office, the office where Ed Klug works. So this is where the defendant would have met Ed Klug in person, and where the other people opening that office noticed there was something going on between the defendant and Kelly Labonte. So now, what about Sunday, October 11th? We do have internet activity in the afternoon on that day. It's afternoon internet activity. Maybe this is Julie. It's the Patagonia website that's being looked at. And then what do we have the next day? Email from Mark to Kelly. This is where he's trying to buy some things for his girlfriend, right? A treat, spoiling his girlfriend. Now imagine we didn't have these Patagonia emails to Kelly. How much do you want to bet Julie would have been blamed for these searches for women's clothing? How much you want to bet she would have been blamed for this computer evidence? But we know who was searching for Patagonia that day. Moving on in October, the trip to Chicago, the very suspicious trip to Chicago. Who needs to stay in a hotel in Chicago when you live in Pleasant Prairie? Well, that's what you do when you're planning a nice long getaway with your girlfriend. And we see it in the day planner, October 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. That's the trip to Chicago. And we see it in the emails. Chicago is the subject. Oakbrook will move on 10/23 and open for business 10/26. Where is Oakbrook in the airport? Any ideas? So this email, right, this planned get together between the defendant and his girlfriend, that happens on October 12th. The early morning hours of October 13th, we have the defendant on the computer planning the Chicago trip. The O'Hare Marriott, Morton's Steakhouse. Then on October 15th, I'm showing you this because it mirrors the defendant's life. On October 15th, we go from Bass Pro Shop to Big Cedar to Windstar Cruises, and we know these early morning searches are the defendant. He's the fisherman, so he's going to Bass Pro Shop. He talked to Kelly about Big Cedar, so he's going to this website. Then Windstar Cruises, early morning hours of October 15th. And what is the next email to Kelly Labonte? This string of emails from October 16th, 1998. Hey, want to run off somewhere? I do love you. Kelly responds, what sparked this bold attempt at messing with me? Sounds wonderful. Where should we go? The defendant says, really bold attempt. If it was really bold, you'd have tickets for the Windstar in your hand. Who was on the internet looking for Windstar? It's obvious, right? These emails are important on October 16th with Kelly Labonte because the defendant has decided he is planning his future with Kelly. He misses her, he wants her, he loves her. He's buying things for her, and he wants to sweep her off her feet with this cruise. Here's what Kelly says. Considering you have a milestone birthday next year, and we would both need some time to clean up our lives, so to speak, I was thinking what a lovely way to spend your birthday. You, me, sunsets, ocean, champagne, no outside issues. See, Kelly understands the practical implications of what the defendant is doing. You just don't go on an expensive, lengthy cruise with your lover on the side. That isn't realistic. So that transforms this conversation into what are you going to do with your spouse? And so Kelly wants time to decide. She wants until the end of the year to decide either way what to do with her issue. The defendant says, fair enough, no deadline on deciding, whatever time needs to be figured out. And then Kelly starts asking him, well, what are you going to do? Do you have it all figured out? The defendant says, I'm thinking so, but then is mostly talking about her, barring seeing a bunch of disgusting habits. Some details to be worked on, but then those are just details, not the big issue. But Kelly wants to know. She wants to know. It was the details I was wondering about. That's what she says. And the defendant just keeps on being vague. Murphy spins on details. Details are just noise in the bigger picture. Kelly, again. And you plan on dealing with the details how? One at a time. So at that point, that's when Kelly says, evasive little shit. Kelly wants to know, what is he going to do? She's asked for the end of the year to deal with her issues, but he's not telling her what he's going to do with his. And isn't telling her what he's going to do with his wife. Kelly calls him out for it. But what we know from the computer is the defendant is forming a plan. He's planning for a future with Kelly by searching for Windstar Cruises. And he's planning for a future without his wife through the other searches on this computer. So it begins with this series of searches on October 16th, 1998, and it starts at 1:54 a.m. I'm not going to show you all of these again, but these are the searches that go from underground to drugs to botulism and ending with poisoning. Then we move to the evening of October 16th, 11:57 p.m., and disturbing searches continue. First, we start with the pipe about the man who was attempting to kill his estranged ex-wife with a pipe bomb. And this browsing session, this one continues for over an hour, about 1 a.m. And I want to show you the various websites that are accessed in this browsing session so you know who is on that computer and doing these searches. To the Nate web. Now I want to zoom in a little bit here. So we go from the pipe bomb article to mercury fulminate is used as a primary explosive in the fabrication of detonators. Then we go to material required. We have here a list of things including glass containers, tape, syringe. Then we go to a warning. Caution. Acid will burn the skin and destroy clothing. Then we go to this. This is the list that Julie found in the defendant's day planner. It's what she took a picture of. We wouldn't have this if she didn't take a picture of it because it wasn't in there anymore when the defendant's day planner was recovered by the police. So what we see here on this list, and we'll come back to this, but we see bottles, booze. So those could be glass bottles. And then we see syringe on this list. Then we see bag hands, like maybe if acid will hurt your hands. Maybe if you've seen that warning on that website. And next we have a website accessed about pool fun. This pool fun article, it talks about reversing the polarity of a pool. And the article claims that that'll cause an explosion. And again, is this true? Is that how that works? I don't know. But that's what the user of this computer, the defendant, was seeing and what he was looking up. And what do we have next? That's the next search. Who's the smoker here? It's Mark. Julie doesn't smoke. So we go to this nicotine search, the nicotine searches. Let's go back to this list. Nicotrol. That is the stop smoking drug that Dr. Borman prescribed to the defendant. Librium. That's also the defendant's prescription. His own drug supply. Who do you think is on the internet doing these searches? And just in case you weren't sure, these are the searches that end the browsing session. They're for Stiefel Nicholas employees. We see the Appleton office here. Remember that address? 740 Ford Street? It was in the defendant's planner, and David Thompson knew it too. Then for some reason, we're going to Colorado Springs. The employee, the branch manager, John Jock Joseph. We heard from Kelly why the defendant was very interested in John Jock Joseph. Because as we learned, the defendant had exhaustive conversations with Kelly Labonte about every man she had had any sort of sexual encounter with including detailed descriptions of that man's penis. And Kelly Labonte knows that in the beginning it wasn't so detailed, but she did tell the defendant about John Jacques Joseph, including a description of his penis. And she remembers that it was the fall of 1998, and she remembers it was before the Blueprint conference, because she remembered seeing him with the defendant, seeing John Jacques Joseph and kind of pointing him out to the defendant. They had talked about this man before. There is absolutely no reason why Julie Jensen would be so interested in John Jacques Joseph, but we know the defendant was. Then finally, we have the search for Kelly. So why is the defendant searching for Kelly? He knows her name, he knows where she works. But it's a search for Kellys, right? They're all Kellys here. What he wants to know, what the defendant is very interested in, is her last name. Kelly's married by this point, but she hasn't changed her last name yet. The defendant's trying to gauge her relationship with her husband. Has she bothered to change her name yet? Is she really committed to this new marriage? He wants to know, and so he's checking. Oh, she's still Labonte K. And that's how this browsing session ended. October 19th, early morning hours, another search for pipe bomb. Maybe Julie Jensen wanted to build a pipe bomb. Then we have the infamous Blueprint conference. We see it reflected in the defendant's day planner. This is the conference in St. Louis, the early morning hours of November 7th. This is when the defendant was out drinking with a group at first, then the bar or club closes down, then they're in the lobby hanging out talking, and he ends up alone with Ed Klug. And they were wife bashing, and the defendant told Ed Klug about wanting to kill his wife, looking up ways on the computer to kill his wife, finding something that would crystallize you from the inside out. Now, we saw that video of Dawn Cooper, and I guess she was supposed to demonstrate that maybe that conversation didn't happen because she was also out in the lobby after bar close. But what happened in the end is she said that she left, and the only people there from her group were Mark Jensen and Ed Klug. And we know that it happened. We know that the defendant told these things to Ed Klug because of Joanne Klug. We know that Ed Klug talked to her multiple times the early morning hours and then again later in the day at the airport. She and Ed have been divorced for years now. I think they said it was finalized in 2013. She's never had a reason to lie about this. It's a very memorable conversation. They even have the phone records, right? Really, he was talking to his wife at those early morning hours? Well, yes, he was. Look at the phone records. And Joanne remembered something in particular. She remembered when Ed was at the airport, and she was thinking about, kind of ruminating on what Ed had told her, and she was confused because she was wondering, well, how does someone die from Benadryl? She remembers Ed telling her about the Benadryl. And so at the airport, she asked him that question about the Benadryl, and that's when Ed says to her, it's the antifreeze. Joanne Klug came in here and she had no reason to lie. She's long done with Ed Klug. But the truth is that conversation happened. And Ed told Stacy Bauer too. She remembers fewer details than Joanne. What she remembered is hearing that the defendant hated his wife and wanted her dead. But she does remember her immediate reaction when she heard less than a month later that Julie Jensen was dead. Oh my God, he killed her. And Stacy Bauer's opinion doesn't matter. It's not of significance, but what matters is she didn't know the Jensens. The only information she had was from Ed Klug. She knew what Ed Klug had told her when she made that statement. So we know that when Ed Klug got back from the Blueprint Conference, before Julie Jensen died, that he told Stacy Bauer about this deeply disturbing conversation that he had had with Mark Jensen. So that when Stacy hears Julie is dead, that is her first thought. Oh my God, he killed her. Finally, we know this conversation with Ed Klug is true. And we know how damning it is based on the defendant's reaction to it. And that's David Thompson. David Thompson is quite a character. He was in pretty big trouble in 2007. But whatever you want to say about him, when he came to tell you what had happened, what the defendant was up to, when he came to court to testify, he wasn't getting out of anything. He admitted he was a bank robber, but he's overcome that, and there's nothing to offer him today because he's not in trouble. Coming here for him was just an inconvenience. And with David Thompson, we have those recorded phone calls from the jail. We know that in the defendant's mind, this plot was real. This plot to sit on Ed Klug, so his testimony would never be heard. And we heard from the video of Nathaniel Clanton that this was the stupidest thing the defendant could have ever done. That's what he thought. But that's how desperately the defendant wanted to silence Ed Klug. There's absolutely no reason for David Thompson to get on the phone with the mother of his child, Kim, and give her Ed Klug's name and work address. The same thing that was in the defendant's day planner, the same thing that was on that internet search. There's absolutely no reason for David Thompson to tell Kim to say everything is as planned to the defendant when he gets on the phone. There's absolutely no reason for the defendant to be asking Kelly to give his parents $500 twice in the most evasive conversation possible. There's absolutely no reason for the defendant to be insistent that his mother get in touch with Kim in multiple calls, except that in the defendant's mind, this was a real plot. And think about that. Why didn't the defendant just leave it to the law and his lawyers? If Ed Klug's a liar, then that's what cross-examination is supposed to show. Cast doubt on him as a witness. And in fact, that's what Nathaniel Clanton said when the defendant discussed this plot with him. He's like, if you think you can beat your case, then why do you need someone to take a witness out? I want you to think about the defendant's thought process. There is a lawful legal way to challenge Ed Klug's evidence in this case, just like there's a lawful legal way to end your marriage with the wife you hate. But that's not what the defendant chose. And he's acting all cagey in these phone calls, thinking he's too clever to get caught. And even when talking to his mother, he references, "Gotta be careful on the phone." This weekend, when we know the defendant was in St. Louis, no internet activity. Once again, we see that pattern. But this weekend is significant in terms of what happened to Julie. She got sick that weekend, and kind of inexplicably so. She threw up on the carpet. And we know that this happened because that carpet cleaning bill, that's from that Monday, the 9th. She threw up on the carpet, and you can see it in the bill. It's also referenced in both of their day planners. Now, this is strange. For an adult to be so sick that they're throwing up in the carpet of their home, that's kind of how kids get sick. Very strange for an adult to be sick in that way. And we know Julie took care of the house, but she was so sick she apparently couldn't clean the carpets. She must have been really sick. Aaron Dillard knew about this. And this is how he explained the defendant cracking, going from the defendant saying, this is all bullshit and I didn't do it, to the confession. The defendant had been talking to Aaron Dillard about his case, getting advice from Aaron Dillard, like get those samples retested, which happened. He had been complaining a lot about Ed Klug. Then he told Aaron Dillard that he wished he hadn't made that mistake, had that drunken conversation with Ed Klug, said that's essentially what was screwing him in his case. And he said that it was on his mind because he tried to poison Julie before he left on that trip. He said he was lucky in a way that she didn't die because he really would have been screwed after saying what he said to Ed Klug. Aaron Dillard knew this, and Aaron Dillard said this, and Aaron Dillard described this admission from the defendant, opened the floodgates for the rest of the defendant's story. And this wasn't in Ed Klug's testimony. Ed Klug didn't know about Julie getting sick. Now, it was in Ted Voigt's testimony. That testimony, though, it didn't happen until January 2008. So that's half a year after Aaron Dillard came forward. And this is what you saw in that video the first week of trial. It seems like long ago now. But Ted Voigt talked about a time when Julie said she was throwing up. And he talked about how suspicious Julie became of the defendant trying to get her to drink something. And he described how Julie was telling him about the defendant trying to get her to drink some wine, and she didn't want to. And he was so insistent that it became a big argument. And I hope you can remember Ted Voigt's testimony, or at least look back on your notes. Because you see, that's the thing. This is such a massive case. There's so many facts and there's so much evidence, and it's hard to keep track of and wrap your mind around. And this incident with Julie getting sick that weekend, that's one of those hidden facts. What's the significance of it? Well, how would Aaron Dillard know? He was with the defendant for less than 4 days. How would he know? Why would he pull out that little fact? Unless the defendant told him that it was significant. So let's go to our next group of searches. The next timeline the computer gives us, November 10th, 1998, once again, the early morning hours. Here's the search for suicide. So maybe this is Julie. Maybe she's on the computer searching for suicide, joining some kind of suicide group or whatever. Let's see what comes next in this browsing session. We go to physician-assisted suicide, leading to a website about an advocate for physician-assisted suicide. Is 40-year-old Julie Jensen a good candidate for physician-assisted suicide? She's healthy. She has 2 young children. She doesn't have a terminal illness. What do you think Dr. Borman would have said if Julie came and asked him about whether physician-assisted suicide was for her? This search makes no sense for Julie. It does make sense for the defendant who's looking for a way to kill. Next, we have a toxicology website. Toxic alcohols. Ethylene glycol. (2:57 a.m.). So right along this same browsing session, we're back to nicotine. Now, we can't actually see every website that was visited, as Jason Ruff from the Wisconsin Department of Justice explained, we have the internet history, that's the Excel file, but we don't have the HTML for all the websites visited, which means we can see that there were websites visited, but we can't actually see them on the screen. But even though we can't see the websites themselves, let's look at some of the websites that were visited on November 22nd, 1998. So 11/22, 4:50 p.m. Oh, 4:50 p.m. This is a Sunday. We have Anatomy Atom, poison. Anatomy Atom, that website comes out on December 2nd and December 3rd. Then we have a Yahoo search, 11/22, 5:01 p.m. for drug interactions. Remember David Naring? David Naring knew the defendant told him that all the time the defendant was looking on his computer at work for drug interactions. Before Julie's death, after Julie's death. Just like Dave Naring said the defendant was looking for drug interactions, so we see it on the home computer. Then we go to the top and we get what looks like prescription list, rxlist.com, drug. Could that be Benadryl? At the very top, could that be diphenhydramine? Generic for Benadryl? All of these searches within minutes of each other, 11/22/98, a Sunday. Now let's go to 11/26/98. Got some science units, measurements. This is all 11/26/98, 11:06 p.m. Potassium chloride, pool solutions. Then 11/29/98, Sierra antifreeze. That website was accessed. 11/29/98. We know the computer history. So December of 1998, these are very significant searches that we're going to look at. This activity. Now we see there's something at 1:18 a.m., but that's actually not a browsing session. That was just one HTML that was accessed. So really in December, when we're talking about the browsing sessions, this is what we're going to be talking about. So we know about December 1st. We know that's the day that Julie goes to Dr. Borman, and we know the day the defendant gives her the first glycol. One of the symptoms of ethylene glycol intoxication. She's acting drunk. That's the first stage of ethylene glycol poisoning. And so what happens when Julie is acting drunk in those early morning hours? 4:35 a.m., we have the search for paroxetine. Paxil. That's the antidepressant. And so this time, this is when the defendant goes on the internet and he looks up this website for paroxetine, Paxil, and he shows it to Julie and he shows her all those side effects, a ton of side effects, as a way to soothe her worries because she doesn't know why she's acting like this, why she's feeling like this, but she went to the doctor and she got that medicine. And so now there's an excuse. This doctor visit was very important to the defendant. Julie was scared. She wasn't just going to drink or eat what the defendant gave her, particularly when he was trying to force it on her, just like with the wine. But what if instead of force, he used deception? Something he's very well practiced. What if he behaved how Julie wanted him to behave all along? What if he acted like he cared? What if he acted like he was concerned? What if he was good to her? He's making sure she's taking her new medication, something to drink along with it. And when she starts feeling these strange effects, he has something to blame it on, something he can show her on the internet, something to soothe her. Remember the morning of December 2nd, Julie Jensen talks to Margaret Voigt on the phone, her neighbor, and she sounded drunk. And that wasn't Julie. Right? Every single witness who knew Julie told you she would not be drunk in the middle of the day. She sounded drunk because she was in the first stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, and Margaret Voigt was worried about her. But Julie said that Mark got the kids to school and he was being good to her. Right before that search for paroxetine or Paxil, we have a bunch of searches for Volvo cars. And this only matters because then we know it's not Julie. If she's sick, if she's feeling very strange, if she's looking for a reason, well, she's not looking at Volvo cars first. So that is the first internet activity, 4:31 to 4:35 on December 2nd. And I'm going to go through this internet activity in detail with you because this is an enormous case with so much material and so many witnesses and so much detail, but it's actually really simple. The person who was on this computer looking up ethylene glycol poisoning killed Julie Jensen. And I'm going to show you it was the defendant. So let's go. We're going to go to the second group of searches, 8:4 to 8:49. An unusual time to see internet activity on this computer, a unique time. And what we know about the morning of December 2nd is that the defendant didn't go to work. He got the kids off to school, David on the bus, Douglas to daycare, but he didn't go to work because he was going to Dr. Borman's that morning. So what happened in this next group of internet searches? We are going to see searches for ethylene glycol poisoning and specifically websites that include the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning. So I'm just going to page through these searches. Ethylene glycol poisoning, that's the first one. Oxalic acid, we learned that that's one of those breakdown products. Hard to say, I think it's fomepizole. That's the antidote. Toxic alcohols. How do patients with toxic alcohol ingestions typically present? We're getting to symptoms. For a moment, we're back to paroxetine, Paxil. What follows that? Ethylene glycol. We're seeing the symptoms: development of acidosis, tachycardia, hypertension, cardiogenic shock. And again, whether this is true or not, this is just on the internet, but this is what the person in front of the computer saw. So why is this research happening at about 8:15 a.m., starting at about 8:15 a.m.? The defendant has a problem. Julie has begun experiencing this first stage of ethylene glycol symptoms, and she's already worried about it. She's worried about it, and the defendant needs to know what's coming next, and he needs to know how to pacify her, or better yet, sedate her. So he decides to go to Dr. Borman. And this is what we saw from the defendant's book. Kelly told us about this book, how the defendant is planning to make some money off of this book. And he describes this trip to Dr. Borman, talking to the receptionist counter, explaining how yesterday Julie was here to see him. Let's look at his description of what he was doing. Wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex gives a presentation of authority and genuine legitimacy. And when accompanying a reasonable and polite request, frequently achieves the desired results. Really gives you a glimpse into the defendant's mind. He goes to Dr. Borman, he's got his suit, he's got his Rolex, he's giving a presentation of genuine legitimacy. Why does he have to give a presentation of genuine legitimacy? This trip to Dr. Borman isn't legitimate at all. And unfortunately for Dr. Borman thought it was. You heard in Dr. Borman's testimony, he had the best interests of Julie Jensen at heart, and he thought the defendant did too, and that's why he gave the defendant that prescription. But Dr. Borman told you that if he had known all the facts, what exactly was going on, he would never have given that prescription to the defendant. But the defendant had this air of genuine legitimacy, and he knew it. So this leads us to the third browsing session on December 2nd, 11:45 to 11:47 a.m. We know the defendant had that Ambien prescription in his hand by 11:13 a.m. That was the video of Mark Hunter. He was shown that picture of the Walgreens thing on the counter. 11:13 a.m., that's when he got that Ambien prescription. It's right on the Walgreens receipt. And he knows, we know that he wanted to give Julie the Ambien right away. That's what the defendant said in his interview, that recorded interview. Julie's first Ambien, he gave it to her Wednesday morning. So he goes home, he gives her the Ambien, and he gets on the internet. Anatomy Adam, that's what this website is. The one with the poisons, down there at the bottom. Go to E, ethylene glycol. Once again, we have poisoning caused by ethylene glycol. We have the symptoms. Symptoms listed: breathing, skin, lips and fingernails blue, heart and blood vessels, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, headache, stupor, unconsciousness. Then we have a gap, 11:45 a.m. to 11:47 a.m., nothing until 9:31 p.m. So what happened after that? What is happening on December 2nd for the Jensen? The defendant, we have no reason to doubt that he did go to work in the afternoon. David's at school, and we know that that's the day Julie was supposed to go to school. That's the Wednesday, but she didn't make it to Therese DeFazio's class that day. And David had the note, and David's note asked if he could go to Eric Shore's house. So David isn't coming home from school on the school bus. He's going to his friend Eric Shore's house. And Douglas is in daycare full-time now, starting that week, full-time daycare. And so the defendant and David and Douglas are not back at that house. In fact, they had karate that night. So they're not back at that house until like 6:30, 7 at night. During all this time that Julie is alone, no internet activity. This is the night where the defendant had to cook because Julie was in bed. He makes mac and cheese. And how was Julie doing during this time period? What was her condition in this time period? Well, the defendant told Paul Griffin in one of those recorded phone calls how Julie was doing. The defendant said, the night before, that's the night when I made the mac and cheese, botched that real good. She wasn't even awake much. I mean, she was in bed the whole time. I mean, she was sleeping most of the time. I think the kids were being quiet to not wake her. I mean, there was some conversation that night, but she was pretty much out of it. So while Julie's pretty much out of it, what's happening on the internet? 9:31 p.m. to 9:43 p.m. Antifreeze poison. Poisoning caused by ingestion of antifreeze with the symptoms. Breathing rapid. We know that was happening. David saw that. Hypoxia. Lips bluish. Fingernails bluish. Skin discoloration, bluish. We saw that as one of the symptoms. Blood pressure, low. Hypotension, low blood pressure. That's what was happening on the internet when Julie was pretty much out of it and didn't leave her bed. Now we're moving to 12:03. The early morning hours, this browsing session on 12:03. 12:44 a.m. to 1:23 a.m. Antifreeze poisoning. How do you think Julie's doing? 12:43 a.m. to 1:23 a.m. Well, we kind of know how Julie's doing. Unconsciousness. Consciousness decreased. Here's another search. Ethylene glycol poisoning. Hypertension. Pulse bounding. Here's another symptom we saw. Tachycardia, fast heartbeat, pulse bounding. Here's another one we saw. Cardiogenic shock. Pulse weak or absent. You know how sometimes you go on the computer because you got like a pain in your side or something's happening with your neck or whatever? You ever look up pulse weak or absent for yourself? How about unconsciousness? You ever look that up when you're experiencing that as a symptom? We know how Julie Jensen was doing from 12:44 a.m. to 1:23 a.m., not because she's on the computer looking at these symptoms, because the defendant is. He's hoping she'll be dead by morning. So then we go to the last browsing session on this computer, 9:40 to 9:42 a.m. on the 3rd. But let's talk first about how Julie was doing the morning of December 3rd, the morning of her death. David said that his mother was breathing very heavily, raspy, labored breathing. He told his friends about it. He later told the detective about it. He asked his dad to take his mom to the hospital, and his dad said no. But his dad said, if she's worse later in the day, we'll take her. What does the defendant say about it? And we know the defendant said this. This is all from that recorded interview. Okay, that's not in dispute, what the defendant said about it. Various points within the interview, he's asked about this multiple times. She couldn't get out of bed that morning. The defendant says, you can ask David. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because mom was sick. She was asleep in bed. The defendant says, there was a question between myself and the kids that morning, whether or not to call an ambulance. Take her to the hospital. The kids wanted to stay home. Her breathing was funny. The defendant says from 6:30 in the morning, she was not able to get out of bed. I mean, she was groggy, almost incoherent, breathing very labored, raspy. The defendant said, I'm not even sure she was coherent. The defendant was asked if Julie sat up in bed. The defendant says, David tells me, we talked about it, David tells me that I was holding her up, supporting her. That's the part of the interview where the defendant talks about those 3 Ambien pills. One Wednesday morning, one Wednesday night, another one Thursday morning after the kids went to school. The defendant says he had to bring her water because she couldn't get out of bed. David told us the last memory he has of his mother is she said, I love you, and he said it too. What David said to the defendant, what the defendant said in his interview is that David told him mom couldn't talk that morning. I'm glad that David's last memory is I love you, but what he was saying to his dad was that his mom couldn't talk that morning. The defendant repeats again, she couldn't get out of bed. He talks about the sleeping pills and how the day before he couldn't rouse her at all. Then finally, we have that recording between the defendant and Paul Griffin, Julie's brother, talking about that morning, December 3rd. The defendant talks about he sat behind Julie on the bed, supporting her when the kids came in, getting ready for school. The defendant says she was weak enough by Thursday. If she could have gotten out of bed, it would have been crawling. Who's on the computer that morning at 9:40 a.m.? We know the defendant wasn't at work. We know he wasn't at work. 3 coworkers say that. We have Ruth Vorwald and her sister, and we have Ted Voigt. All of them, those witnesses, place the defendant either going to his house or at his house, arriving to his house between 9:15 and 9:30 a.m. that morning. He had to get Douglas to daycare. He went to pick up a check from someone down the road, but those witnesses say that he was at his house or going to his house between 9:15 and 9:30 a.m. And here's the defendant's dilemma. He was hoping when he left that morning that Julie would be dead. But he comes back and she's still alive. So he goes on the internet one more time. That search, when Julie was incoherent, when she couldn't get out of bed, when David said she couldn't even talk, there's that search for ethylene glycol poisoning. Then we go to a website for diabetic ketoacidosis, because we learned in the medical evidence that you get acidotic from this ethylene glycol poisoning. And apparently something similar can happen to a diabetic person in crisis. The defendant's looking at that too. The last thing on the computer, ethylene glycol poisoning. This is why the defendant ultimately suffocates his wife. She would have died from ethylene glycol poisoning, untreated as she was, but the defendant can't take her to the hospital. And first, when he comes home and she's not dead, he hopes if maybe he just turns her. We know she's unconscious because of how her arm is under her body as he turns her. He's hoping if he just turns her, maybe has her face in the pillow, maybe she'll just die. And he leaves and he comes back. But she's still alive. She didn't die, and he promised, and he's running out of time. And Aaron Dillard was able to put into words what the defendant did. Aaron Dillard gained the defendant's trust, as Aaron Dillard does. But the evidence was all there to begin with. That promise to David, Julie's body, how it was positioned, the medical evidence of the hemorrhage, the suffocation. Dr. Chambliss suspected suffocation from the very beginning. So there's things we're never going to know in this case. We're not going to know what the defendant did when he didn't go to work on December 3rd, as he claimed. Dave Naring, Rosemary McGinnis, Meredith Perez, the receptionist at this small office, they all know he wasn't there that day. What exactly was he up to? What exactly was he doing? How exactly did he clean up? What did he do with the ethylene glycol he used? What about the juice that he put it in? Was that juice still in the fridge, or did he clean that up like the ethylene glycol? One thing we do know is the defendant did try to clean up. One of the reasons I spent all this time showing you the internet history is that the defendant never wanted you to see it. He deleted the internet history on this computer. We know he deleted it 11/29, 12/2, and 12/3. It's only because the police had the foresight to seize this computer in 1998, and only because the computer was analyzed by experts at the Wisconsin Department of Justice to see and get this deleted internet history, the defendant didn't want you to see it. Now, it seems that in this case, everything is blamed on Julie Jensen. But remember, this isn't a murder or just a sad suicide. It's a murder or a suicide and a frame-up. If this was Julie Jensen on the computer, and I've already showed you that that's impossible, but if this was Julie Jensen on the computer, hypothetically, why would she delete that internet history? It's not what you do after planting with your friends and your neighbors that your husband's trying to kill you. If you want to frame your husband, you don't delete it. But it is what you do when you're trying to clean up and cover your tracks. So finally, at the close here, let's talk about Julie Jensen's two greatest fears. Dr. Borman said in his testimony She didn't want to be labeled as crazy, and she didn't want to lose her kids. With her death, Julie Jensen lost David and Douglas. And in death now, nearly 25 years later, she's labeled as crazy. We're having a whole trial on the topic of whether Julie's crazy. The tragedy of Julie Jensen, and there are many, is she can't escape gaslighting even in death after all this time. Because we're told that Julie apparently has this family history of depression that makes her a high risk for suicide, even though the actual evidence is that that history is so minor that it makes her family indistinguishable from thousands or perhaps even millions of other families. And that family history pales in comparison to the history of other families, like where there have been actual suicides. We're told that Julie Jensen is at a high risk for suicide. And I can hardly even begin to comment on the absurdity of Dr. West's testimony. But Dr. West said Julie Jensen's view of reality was distorted. The only thing that I saw that was distorted is Dr. West's view of the evidence. But one preposterous thing Dr. West said was how Julie showed signs of suicidality. Even though she'd never made a suicidal statement, she'd never shown any signs of suicidal ideation or a plan. She certainly never attempted suicide, even though Julie Jensen specifically denied being suicidal on December 1st. There's literally nothing, apparently, that Julie could have said to evade Dr. West's diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Nothing she could have said. And what about all these statements she made of fear? To Ted Voigt, to Margaret Voigt, to Therese DeFazio, to the defendant's own sister. We're told she's just so crazy. Too crazy to be believed. I mean, is she actively framing the defendant, or is she just so delusional that she thinks the defendant's trying to kill her? We're told that Julie used the internet, that she would use the internet, even though there's absolutely no proof of that. We saw how that internet usage mirrors the defendant's life, and there's nothing like that for Julie. Not a single example. Dr. Hale and Dr. Thomas, they tell you, they act as though Julie could have been on that computer, even after she got so sick the night of 12/2 and into the early morning of 12/3, and then finally at 9:42 a.m. on 12/3. Even though that's contrary to the defendant's own words, the words of the defendant. And you know what? We're believing the defendant's words when he described Julie's condition, not just selectively because we want to believe those words because they're helpful to the state. We believe it and we know it's true because of David. The defendant knew David was talking about his mom and about her condition and about his last memories of his mother. The defendant knew the detective was talking to David. That's why there's all those weird statements in that interview. Well, David said, you can ask David. The defendant cannot lie about Julie's condition on the 2nd and the 3rd because David knows the truth. And then finally, these doctors, Dr. Thomas in particular, they blame Julie. Why didn't she call for help? My goodness, if she was so afraid of being poisoned, why didn't she call for help? Well, why didn't the defendant? Julie had in her system ethylene glycol and Ambien and Librium and Paxil and Benadryl. She, a 115-pound woman, had 3 Ambien, a brand new drug for her, in 24 hours, less than 24 hours. And the defendant was there. He saw her condition. He was there the morning of the 2nd, the night of the 2nd, the day of the 3rd. And he was there when Dr. Borman told him, if your wife's condition worsens, take her to the ER. And he was the one hearing David asking to take mom to the hospital when she couldn't speak. So, according to the defense doctors, that's Julie's fault. That this woman on these 3 Ambien, sedated and drugged, it's her fault that she called for help. It's like the more you get paid in this case, the less you can see the obvious. Julie's even blamed for Laura Coster leaving her job. Somehow that's Julie's fault. Julie's blamed for David's cough, David's tics, even though it was at her insistence that they scheduled that specialist appointment for David after those parent-teacher. Dr. Borman testified they scheduled that specialist November 25th, but somehow that's still Julie's fault. Apparently everything, all ills can be blamed on Julie. Apparently she's crazy, and she's the one who's on that computer. But you know, it isn't her whose hobby it was to create a scare, invent years of terrorizing harassment using an array of photos. And her who took on the name of Warm Irish Eyes to catfish and torment a coworker. So let's go back to the evidence. At the time of her death, Julie Jensen was in a dilemma of the defendant's creation. And she described this to Therese DeFazio and to Ted Voigt. Either her husband was trying to kill her, to poison her, or he was trying to drive her crazy, make her look crazy, so in the divorce he could take the kids from her, as he said he would do. And Julie was a smart person, but she didn't know what to do in that dilemma. And she couldn't do anything rash, anything that looked reckless or irrational. She had to make a plan. She had to leave in an orderly and rational fashion with the kids, but the defendant had been planning longer, and he executed his plan first. Let's look at him executing his plan. This, we see here two things that are the same. This is the picture that Julie Jensen took of the defendant's day planner and made sure she got it to the police. It says, withdrawn, kids, locked chest, crying about miscarriage. Next to that, the defendant's actual day planner, seized by the police. Same thing. Another example. A picture Julie Jensen took and gave to the police. Locked chest. Locked in bedroom, morning. Jobs quit. Crying about miscarriage. Suddenly detached. Julie Jensen took that picture and gave it to the police. And the same thing, defendant's day planner. Planner, by the way, found right here, computer, in that black bag, the defendant's day planner. This I just showed you. This is gaslighting once again, and Julie saw it. Even if the police had made a mistake and not seized the defendant's day planner, even if that planner had not been seized, we would still have those photos. The police would have them because Julie gave it to them. And did Julie give those to the police to say, hey, police, look how crazy I am? Julie saw the defendant's plan. He wanted her to look crazy. She told this to Margaret Voigt, how the defendant was asking about this miscarriage, which was from years ago, and taking notes, and it made no sense to her. And she saw these notes and she knew they weren't true and wondered what the defendant was up to. And she made sure the police had it. Because Julie isn't crazy. It's just how the defendant wanted her to look. It's a continuation of the years of psychological warfare the defendant waged against his wife, but now the purpose was to make her look crazy so he can murder her, so he could give her a substance that would crystallize her from the inside out, a substance undetectable at autopsy, using a searches on the computer that he also thought would be undetectable once he deleted them. He thought he could trick Julie and the police, and honestly, if it ever came down to it, a jury. And made a few mistakes. Ed Goog, Aaron Dillard, David Thompson, the deleting of the internet history that wasn't deleted enough. Maybe he would have been able to deceive and gaslight his way out of this too. Julie wasn't crazy. She was responding to the insane situation the defendant had orchestrated around her. If you look at the evidence in this case, if you look at the evidence, and if you aren't getting paid too much to see it, you'll believe Julie. You'll believe Julie when she said she was afraid, when she said she was afraid that the defendant was trying to kill her, when she said she saw the defendant looking things up on the computer, when she said he thought he was trying to poison her. You'll believe Julie said she was do it. Believe Julie when she said her boys were everything to her, that she loved them, she didn't want to lose them, she would never leave them. You'll believe Julie, and you'll find the defendant guilty.
Folks, we'll take our break now. We'll talk about the case. We're getting real close, but go back and take your break, okay? For 10 minutes, thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming by. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up. I'm going to take a little quick break too, and then I will be right back. I'm so glad you guys are here and able to watch this. Jen says I was able to watch a few times where he's like, I know what I know. I know what I heard. Don't argue, blah, blah, blah. The other day, he was so funny. The jury comes in and he says, I'm so glad you're here. The roads were really icy today. And he's going on and he goes, I'm going to give you guys some extra time for lunch. So, because of the weather and everything, in case you have errands to run. And he goes, then he looks at everybody. He goes, all right, we're adjourning for lunch. And it was so funny because they all looked around like, is he serious? TB says, not sure how I stumbled on your channel, but happy to be here. I'm happy you're here too. It's nice to have you. All right, I'm going to take a break. Then I'll come back. We can chit chat. I am dying to know what you guys think. I think her opening was brilliant, but we'll come back and discuss that in a minute. Jen, you are too kind. Thank you. Wow, you too, Lisa. Thanks for the support. I have fun with this. I really do. I am watching. They're still on a break. TB says, Rebecca, may I ask you something about the Nicholas Cruz case quickly? Quickly, yes. Let me, let's go full screen here. How about that? I think I need to refill my coffee too. Now, the defense attorney is the male. There's two females and a male. Attorney Perry, he's going to be giving the closing. And I think the plan is after that, the judge is going to send the jury to lunch. Then after lunch, during lunch, we'll take a break. I'll come back. I'll do a part 2. I'll end this live. I'll do a second live. That'll be part 2. And then on this afternoon, after they come back from lunch, I believe the male prosecutor, the one that's been on this for 25 years, he's going to do the rebuttal argument, and they will send the jury to start deliberating. TB says, when the parents got their time to speak, I was surprised the judge allowed them to berate the defense. I understand their feelings, but is this really accepted in court? Well, there's a thing called Marcy's Law, where you have to allow the victims to express themselves. It's part of the healing process. It's more for them than it is for the defendant. But I think they took it a little too far in that case, berating the defense the way they did. That's just my opinion. They didn't need to go there, and they did. I mean, it wasn't their fault. They're just doing their jobs. Everybody is entitled to a defense, to a trial, and to a reasonable defense. Yeah. It was very sad for those parents. That was a long time ago. We've got a lot of great trials coming up, though. I'm still doing the Murdoch case. I will do a regular show today. It'll be a short version where I do talk about what happened in the Murdoch case yesterday. So you guys will have to look forward to later. And then after the jury retires to begin their deliberations this afternoon, I will end the second live, and I'll come back if they have a verdict. I anticipate they will be deliberating for quite some time. I have a tickle in my throat. Oh yeah, Lisa. Those statements are always gut-wrenching. It's so tough on these victims. Jen knows. Jen's a counselor. She has to counsel these people like that, has been through these kind of traumas. So, and that, like I said, it's under Marcy's Law that they have to be given the opportunity to make a statement, an impact statement, and it's usually really tough to watch. Now, in this case, I don't know who would give an impact statement. She's deceased. It could be the children, but my understanding is they support their father. So both David and Douglas are supporting their dad. They're both adults now. I did not have what David seen yesterday. I don't think it was anything. He was 8 when this happened. So what he remembers was probably very little. TV says, I was surprised how Daryl was allowed to behave like that in court too. I know judge wanted to seem unbiased, but was that taken too far? No, she didn't want to have to do this again. She does not want that case overturned on appeal. So she, and he was representing himself. That's always a tough stitch in it. And I certainly wouldn't have wanted to do that case twice. Boy, the victim impact statements in that case were just brought tears to my eyes. But, she had to give him every opportunity. And he was like, I don't know if he was bipolar, because like one time he'd be really quiet and polite, and the next thing he'd be like off his rocker. It was really weird. Okay, they are back. We're going to go back to the courtroom. Maybe. There we go. The judge has not turned on the sound yet. That's why you're not hearing anything. As soon as it's just he has total control over it. The woman sitting behind the prosecutor, just FYI, that's the prosecutor's wife. She is on the defense team. She is also a lawyer. There, but we're back. If you lost me, just go out and come back in again, and it should work. Still no, I don't know what he's saying because he doesn't have the microphone turned on. And don't forget to drop a thumbs up. Hit that thumbs up button, guys, on your way in or out today. If you're not watching the whole thing, not on the defense TV, the woman sitting behind the prosecutor, that's his wife. She is a lawyer. Okay, now the jury is coming in. He still hasn't turned on the microphone. Somebody needs to
We're back on the record.
There he goes.
On Mark D. Jensen, 2002, CF 314. The appearances are the same. The jury is back in the courtroom. Where are the phase of the defendant's closing argument? Mr. Perry, you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. I want to say how grateful I am that I'm able to stand here and speak to you all after these last few weeks. Things have not been presented exactly chronologically, or I think in the easiest to understand manner. We've had video testimony. Sometimes that's felt out of order, out of chronological order. Sometimes it's hard to hear. It'd be hard for anyone to catch everything that's been presented. Myself, Ms. Krause, Ms. Renner, and most of all, Mark Jensen, are so relieved to have such an obviously attentive and serious group of jurors. So thank you for that. Now, I'm not going to yell and shout about penis pictures. I don't yell and shout about really anything. During this trial, we've tried to be measured and analytical. And that's how I'm going to try to approach this as well. Because this man is charged with homicide. And emotional appeals that cloud the relevant evidence is not what's needed. In thinking about all the things that have been presented and trying to organize it, the photos, the harassment, the penis drawings, that was a lot of it. How much of it is actually relevant to the prosecution's allegation that Mark Jensen committed first-degree intentional homicide? I think a lot of it is meaningless. A lot of it serves no purpose other than an attempt to establish that Mark Jensen had pornography in 2002 on his computer that the prosecution has a problem with. Throughout this time that I have, I'm going to try to focus on what Mark Jensen is actually charged with and the relevant evidence regarding it. You heard the judge read the instructions, and I just want to touch on one of those instructions. Because in America, when you're charged with a crime, you have no burden of proving your innocence. It's the government that has to prove it before you can be found guilty. That's because you can guarantee you won't commit a crime, but you can never guarantee you won't be accused of one. And you've heard this jury instruction of the level that's required when you're accused beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury instruction does a couple of things. First, it tells you what a reasonable doubt is. And then, in sort of a roundabout way, it tells you what beyond a reasonable doubt means. First, a reasonable doubt is, and you heard this, is a doubt based upon reason and common sense. The sort of doubt that would cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause or hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life. Pause or hesitate when called to act upon the most important affairs in life. What are the most important affairs of life? Is it buying a house? Is it choosing whether to trust somebody? Is it buying a car? If you're buying a house, at the home inspection, you see a hairline crack in the foundation. Do you pause or hesitate to have to need more information before you move forward? That's reasonable doubt. That's the standard in Wisconsin. And that instruction about the level of proof that the prosecution bears in this case before you can be convicted of a crime. What if you find out that your home inspector has a fraud conviction? Do you pause? So that's reasonable doubt. But what does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? First of all, it means nothing is giving you any pause. But the instruction actually tells us what beyond a reasonable doubt means. It says you are not to search for doubt, you're to search for the truth. And that makes sense, because if you were to search for doubt, that would mean the defense carries some sort of burden. And we know that's not true. The entire burden is on the prosecution. It's the truth. Has the prosecution proven its case such that you're convinced its allegation is the actual truth? If there's something pause or hesitation when considering the prosecution's allegation of what, when, where, why, how, that's reasonable doubt. And it's only when you can comfortably say there's no pause or hesitation that you can say that the prosecution has an allegation to be the truth. It's not guessing. It's not guessing at what you think may have happened. It's a careful analysis. But it's a very high burden. Through the course of my time to talk with you, I want to talk about memory and how we all know how memories change. How they changed in this case. You saw that with witnesses testifying now about memory in 2008 and 2007, in 1998, maybe in 2002 when they were first interviewed by the investigators. How it was years before investigation even spoke to people in this case. how it was 9 years before some people even claimed they remembered anything. This trial has taken about 3 weeks. Wait and see when you go into deliberations if you all have the same memory of what each witness said. I want to talk about lies, because the centerpiece of the state's entire prosecution is a lie. And I want to talk about something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when someone searches for and interprets information in a way that confirms or supports one's belief. It's not scientific. It's the opposite of scientific. It's not a process that results in a fair assessment of evidence. It's the opposite of fair. We see it in the state's bending facts to science when it should be applying science to the facts. We see it in how Julie Jensen, we see it in the systematic ignoring that certain facts just don't exist. We talked about things that cause you to pause or hesitate in the most important affairs of life. These are things that can cause more than just a pause. These are full stops. Things just out of the gate. There have been some, and this fits with what I've just talked about. There's this assertion that there's a high five when Mark came back to his house on December 4th. We talked with Detective Ratsburg at length about the handoff of that house on December 4th and the police that were there and all the observations of Mark Jensen. And you didn't hear anything about an observation of a high five and the timing of when this would have happened and it being late at night and how everything was being observed and recorded. This idea that Mark Jensen threw away her belongings. Now, I mean, I'm not going to be able to go through everything everyone said, and you're going to have to rely on your notes for some of these things. But the throwing away the belongings, when we dug into what does that mean, what was actually observed, very little. And very little knowledge or no knowledge at all about whether things were set out for a donation, what was in bags. Somebody recognized something that they thought may have belonged to Julie Jensen. And from that, this memory was created that, oh my God, Mark Jensen threw away all of Julie Jensen's things. Go back and look at what was actually said about that. He hated her. And that's what was going on. I mean, that's really, I'd say it's a lot more complicated. We heard just yesterday how Mark and his son were building a Christmas rod, a fishing rod for Christmas for Julie Jensen. Those day planner notes, and then combined with her later statements about how he's encouraging her to see a doctor. The investigation that was done in this case, you know, even the things found in that office, the box of zip drives, you know, nothing was fingerprinted. This theory, this idea that Julie Jensen never had anything to do with the computer, just very little investigation that was done in most of these things. They weren't looking for ethylene glycol. This idea that it was hidden, or what was Mark Jensen doing on December 3rd? They weren't looking for ethylene glycol when they searched the house. Detective Ratsburg acknowledged that. He said, when we looked back at the video, yeah, I could see things in the garage that looked like probably antifreeze. They took the Playboys. They didn't take the antifreeze. I need to spend some time talking about Aaron Dillard. Aaron Dillard, Aaron Galvin, Kyle Rezick. I don't know who this person is. He's an actual con man. He's someone who has conned educated people out of their life's savings. He's an international man. And he's never stopped his lying, and he's never stopped his deceit. How does a con man convince people to buy his stories? He blends facts with fiction so that it sounds possible. He tells people what they want to hear. He presents himself as a reasonable, well-spoken individual. I think you saw that in here. You saw how he presents himself. In Lithuania, these families wanted visas to America, so Aaron Dillard took their life savings, and he did that 7 times over. Think of the things that Aaron Dillard was willing to do for a few $100s or a few $1,000s. He lied about who he was. He defrauded companies. He bought check stock, created false companies, false payroll checks. He researched how to be a medical and surgical equipment seller in order to defraud Wendy Reamer, who believed his name was Kyle Rezick, over and over again. You heard Lori Brown. She was a lawyer and then an administrator of a law firm, a smart, educated woman. She got defrauded by Dillard. She described him as personable, knowledgeable, and that he instilled a lot of confidence. Her opinion? He's not a truthful or honest person. How about Deborah Teagle Spears? She testified in this case. She met Kyle Rezick. She lent him money. Eventually, she went into his wallet to find out what his real name is and ran a check on him. Do you remember what Miss Spears said about Dillard when asked about his character for truthfulness? She said, he has no character. He's a con man. He uses people for what he can get out of them. So on August 14th, 2007, when Aaron Dillard got to the Kenosha County Jail, what was he willing to do? He had been out on extended supervision and was coming back to court to determine how long he was going to go back to prison. He was AWOL from supervision. He got pulled over on May 31st, 2007. At that point, he hadn't reported to his agent since the previous October. When he got pulled over and he had a suspended registration, he lied to a police officer and said he was his brother, Mike Kaiser. And then while claiming to be Michael Kaiser, he blamed the suspended registration on his brother, Aaron Dillard. This is what he does. The police figured it out and he got charged with obstructing an officer. He had 17 violations while out on probation. He had cheated Dennis Ritt out of money. He told Dennis Ritt that he had a telecommunications company in Lithuania. He convinced him to lend him money, never paid him back. He wrote a check from a closed bank account to Dennis Ritt, knowing it's not good. He had defrauded Lori Brown. He had defrauded Cassandra Ivey. Cassandra Ivey had paid him $6,200 and had a construction contract with Dillard. For that, he got charged with theft by contractor and home improvement fraud. Dillard was facing 7 years on that case. For the reconfinement, he knew that his probation agent was recommending he get the maximum time available of 4.5 years. And it was an aggressive recommendation. I asked Aaron Dillard this when he was testifying, and he acknowledged, he said he was aware of the probation agent's justification for the maximum sentence. And I read it to him, and he remembered it. It is obvious that Mr. Dillard is in need of serious CP, but his criminal behavior is well beyond the need of cognitive thinking. His repetitive, deviant thinking is just in plain need of confinement. Even though prisons are normally used for rehabilitative purposes, Mr. Dillard is in desperate need of incarceration. It is the suggestion of this document that persons with criminal behavior of this caliber showed no guilt or remorse. Their goal in life is to be a successful criminal. They are motivated by the power they feel to manipulate others, sometimes for material gain. So when he got to the Kenosha jail on August 14th, 2007, he was facing 9 months on that obstructing charge, 7 years on the theft by contractor home improvement fraud case, and a recommendation of 4.5 years from his probation agent. What was Aaron Dillard willing to do for a few $1,000s? Ruin people's lives. And you've seen what Aaron Dillard was willing to do to get out of years of prison. When Aaron Dillard got to the Kenosha jail on August 14th, 2007, he immediately recognized Mark Jensen. He knew about him from articles, he knew it was a high-profile case, and within 30 minutes he was talking with him. That's how quickly Aaron Dillard found his mark. And what did Dillard claim? He basically talked nonstop with Mark Jensen about his case. The evening of the 14th, all day on the 15th, all day on the 16th. He said that Mark Jensen shared the transcript of the Klug hearing and then talked all about his case. He said that Mark protested his innocence all evening of the 14th. He said that Mark protested his innocence all day on the 15th. And then on the 16th, Aaron Dillard said, you know, we all did something to get here. And Mark said, yeah, and then gave him a full confession. Do you remember the 7-hour interrogation by Detective Ratsberg? You were shown 45 minutes of it. Highly trained interrogator. I guess if Detective Ratsberg had said, come on, right? Aside from just how unbelievable this story is, the prosecution bought it completely. Dr. Mainland bought it. Dr. Chambliss bought it. Mark Jensen was charged in 2002 with homicide in this case. Then in 2008, after hearing about Aaron Dillard's claim, they changed their opinions. Dr. Chambliss went from undetermined to asphyxia by smothering. Dr. Mainland went from ethylene glycol poisoning to ethylene glycol poisoning with probable terminal asphyxia. Why was everyone so willing to be victimized by Aaron Dillard? I think it's because the science and the evidence don't support the theory that Mark Jensen killed Julie Jensen with ethylene glycol. I think it's because it makes no sense that if Julie Jensen was paranoid and not eating or drinking anything from Mark, that then she'd suddenly eat and drink everything he gave her. And according to Doctors Chambliss, Mainland, and the prosecution, where could Aaron Dillard have learned these details? We're not wondering that anymore, are we? On August 11th, 2007, 3 days before Aaron Dillard showed up, Mark Jensen received 2 oversized envelopes from his attorney. In those envelopes were the transcripts of Ed Klug and the interrogation of Mark by Detective Ratsberg. Now, you heard from Nathaniel Clanton. Nathaniel Clanton's time in J Block actually overlapped a little with Aaron Dillard. I think he said he got there on August 16th. Nathaniel Clanton explained how Mark Jensen handled himself in the jail. He said Mark had 2 bins of paperwork. Mark would freely discuss details and share that paperwork with other inmates. He'd share his police reports. He'd freely share his case files. Nathaniel Clanton explained that Mark would even share this with the people that were only there for a few days. And Nathaniel Clanton did more than that. He explained what an awful idea it is to share your information in a jail. People will use it against you. They'll take the information, they'll twist it, they'll add some lies, and they'll make it look like you're confessing to something you didn't do. Mr. Clanton explained that happens quite a bit in jails. When Detective Ratsberg interrogated Mark Jensen, he told you that he was trying to come up with different scenarios to get Mark to confess. Detective Ratsberg had the autopsy, and he was trying to make his scenarios fit what he thought were the autopsy findings. He testified to that. You heard Detective Ratsberg's imagined scenarios that he proposed to Mark Jensen. Her arm was actually here. I'll show you how she was, okay? Her arm is actually across her body like that, okay? And it's an unnatural position. Do you sleep when you're on your side with your arm across like that? I know there was some type of contact there. There had to be in the chest, this chest area, Mark. There's no question about that. And the only person that could have done that was you. I'm thinking before you left, you pushed on her maybe. Now, she was frail at the time. She was frail. You said she was labored breathing. That makes sense, and I believe that. Okay, I know that probably happened, but she's frail. And you just innocently, I don't want to, pushed her like that. And could that have caused something? I mean, we have petechiae of the lungs. There's some type of contact here in the throat. There's also been an indication on the throat, as I showed you in Dr. Chambliss's report. It just did not appear there. Something and somebody had to touch her. That's the only way it could get there. There's no doubt about that. And did you push her, touch her on the throat maybe? Maybe like this? Maybe when you brought her over this way, you pushed her back on the chest and then went back and brought her up again. You know, you would have pushed her back. We still have to explain the nose part. The head pushed into the pillow. How are we going to explain that? I mean, that's there. Something had to push it down. There's 3 things that happened here. Head being pushed, the nose, some type of contact here at the throat, and some type of contact here in the chest. We know that happened, okay? You were the only one there. You had to do something, Mark. Dr. Mainland acknowledged, testifying this time, that Aaron Dillard could have gotten those details that made up his claim from this transcript. She agreed that Aaron Dillard's claim was not found in the Klug transcript, but was found in Detective Ratsberg's claims in the interrogation transcript, and that those claims lined up with the autopsy report. The prosecution has insisted, though. They keep insisting. Aaron Dillard denied reading anything except for the Klug transcript. Well, his claim would be a lot less convincing if he admitted to making it up. Can you trust what Aaron Dillard says when a decade of prison is on the line? Can you trust him when $50 is on the line? Dr. Mainland said she wouldn't buy a used car from Aaron Dillard. Does Aaron Dillard give you pause? To me, it warrants slamming on the brakes and never wanting to engage with the man in any way. We have to look further because his story has some reveals. Look closely at it. He said that Mark wishes he hadn't opened his stupid mouth around his coworker about him wanting to kill his wife. That's what's fucking him now. That's what Aaron Dillard wrote. So the person who allegedly regrets saying something to Ed Klug while maintaining his innocence, while denying that he ever said anything to Ed Klug, would then open his mouth and offer a full confession to the person that you're saying these things to? That doesn't make any sense. Aaron Dillard says, on a Tuesday, he took her to a doctor. That's a small detail buried in his statement. But we know from Dr. Borman that Julie came alone to that doctor appointment. He first describes Julie Jensen on December 2nd as just throwing up a little. He then changes it to really just vomiting. There's no vomit anywhere. And when she died, her stomach was full. He says that Mark came home and that Julie Jensen was breathing better. But we learned from Dr. Hale, the only one who testified in this courtroom that was qualified to discuss ethylene glycol poisoning, the only toxicologist you heard from. As long as a person is still processing ethylene glycol, they'd be in phase 2. Their breathing wouldn't get better. They'd be trying to get rid of that, to blow off that carbon dioxide. And because Detective Ratsberg isn't a forensic pathologist, he proposed an asphyxiation death, but didn't take into account that there were no marks or injuries to the inside of Julie Jensen's mouth when described as shoving her face into a pillow until she asphyxiated. He didn't take into account that nothing was aspirated, nothing was regurgitated. There were no injuries on her back. Would you buy a used car from Aaron Dillard? His story is a lie meant only to benefit himself. When he created his story, he had over a decade of prison that he used this to reduce to 0. Now, he's got even more at stake. He's facing decades in prison right now, and he's getting another letter from the prosecutor, which is the same thing he got in 2008, resulting in no time for lying to that officer. Would you rely on Aaron Dillard for anything except to lie? I want to talk about the autopsy. Dr. Michael Chambliss wasn't the medical examiner for Kenosha County. He came down on December 4th autopsy. He did his autopsy report. He did nothing else with the case. He didn't review reports. He didn't send things out for studies. I think he said he didn't even review the toxicological results. He did an autopsy, and then he turned it all over to the medical examiner's office, and his role was done. That autopsy was in 1998. I think the faxed autopsy report was in February of 1999. The person he turned it all over to, Dr. Maureen Lavin, we never heard from her in this trial. A side note, even though Dr. Chambliss, even though the only report he ever did said that the cause of death was undetermined, he felt pretty comfortable in court giving an opinion to cause and manner of death without having done that investigation that a medical examiner does. Do you remember Dr. Lindsay Thomas testifying? The renowned and respected forensic pathologist? The prosecution attacked her because she didn't know the acronyms Mark Jensen and Kelly used in their emails. But Dr. Chambliss, he told you that his involvement in this case and his investigation was done at the time he issued that preliminary report. So what did he note and how did he explain it? He agreed that Julie Jensen had a substantial amount in her stomach. He agreed there was no way of knowing how long it was in there. It was very likely she had delayed gastric emptying. He identified petechiae in the cardio area. He found no injuries to the insides of Julie Jensen's lips and cheeks. He found no fluid in the nose. There was no aspirated food in the respiratory system. He found zero evidence of external forces to the chest. He found zero evidence of trauma to the abdomen. There were no rib fractures. And then he identified a small amount of hemorrhage involving the soft tissues and muscles attached to the left, second, third, and fourth ribs. Remember this theory that exists that from Aaron Dillard that this grown man climbed on top of Julie Jensen's back and forced her lungs to close. Set aside whether the evidence actually established that this hemorrhage was just post-mortem lividity or congestion since Julie Jensen was lying on her side. And set aside for a moment that the picture actually just shows darkness on all the ribs on that side of the body, demonstrating that this is just congestion. Dr. Chambliss even said this could be post-mortem artifact. He testified he doesn't know when this injury, if it even is an injury, even occurred. He said it could have been caused by bumping into something. And then he was asked whether Julie Jensen's death could have been positional asphyxia, whether she had gotten herself into a position and she couldn't breathe. And he said no. And the reason he said no is he said, because that wouldn't explain the hemorrhage on the ribs. This is the very thing he just had testified could have been caused by bumping into something, could have been post-mortem artifact. And if it was a hemorrhage, he was unable to say when it occurred. But then the reason he rejected the idea that Julie Jensen might have gotten herself into a tough breathing position is that it didn't explain the very thing he agreed had several completely innocent explanations for. I don't know what to do with that. That's confirmation bias. That's some sort of circular logic that does not belong in a courtroom. That's wholesale reliance on Aaron Dillard. Even with that, then Dr. Chambliss agreed that if Aaron Dillard's a liar, then Dr. Chambliss's cause and manner of death would be undetermined. Science didn't lead to Dr. Chambliss's opinions. He made the science fit the story told by Aaron Dillard. Dr. Mainland also, she says, that could be hemorrhage, it could be congestion, I don't know what it's from, when it's from. Could be post-mortem artifact. After Aaron Dillard, it's hemorrhage. It's terminal asphyxia. She said she wouldn't buy a used car from Aaron Dillard. I'm sorry, but that says all you need to know about how Dr. Mainland's use of the phrase to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. In its opening statement, the state called Kelly Labonte the motive. Excuse me. Throughout this case, how many times did we hear about the cruise they were planning? At some point, she described to Mark Jensen all the men she had ever been with. And yesterday, when Mr. Jamboys was cross-examining Dr. Sarah West, he argued these four things. He said, Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte had an affair, and they had made a plan to go on a cruise in 1999. Kelly Labonte then divorced her husband. Then Julie Jensen died. Isn't that convenient? Do you remember those questions? Well, the problem is the chronology is completely off. They had an affair. No one's contesting that. Julie Jensen had an affair. Mark Jensen had an affair. I'm not saying that makes them even or something, but these affairs happened, and it's not being contested by us at one bit. Kelly Labonte talked about divorce. And then Kelly Labonte called off the affair with Mark Jensen. And buried in all the emails that were presented in this case, on October 27th, 1998, Kelly Labonte says, I did realize I need to give this a fair shot or get the hell out. I've decided to give it a fair shot. First, a 6-year relationship that I fought tooth and nail for and a 1-month marriage deserves at least one way out very much less. I need to focus on the positives of this marriage and see what happens. Mark's response, you've always got my support. That was October 27th, 1998. Kelly Labonte called off the affair in October. She ultimately left her husband. That was in January of 1999. And then she got divorced in March or April of 1999. So this argument, how convenient for Mark Jensen that Julie Jensen died after this divorce from Kelly Labonte with her husband, it's changing the facts to fit the narrative. It's clear that this marriage was in trouble well before Mark Jensen had his affair. This marriage was in so much trouble that when Julie Jensen had her affair, she actually filed for divorce in 1991. I want to talk about Ed Klug. Think of how unbelievable Ed Klug's testimony is. How unbelievable he is as a person. The Blueprint Conference was in November of 1998. Julie Jensen died a month later. Over 3 years went by, and he reached out to the police department because he had something to say. And what did he have to say? That Mark might have used a computer in the Appleton office, but all the computers have since been changed out. That's it. That was his contribution. And 5 more years went by, and we're now 9 years from when Julie Jensen died, and Ed Klug gets contacted. And Ed Klug suddenly has a much more interesting story for the prosecutors. You know what? A month before Julie Jensen died, Mark Jensen told Ed Klug, someone he did not have a personal relationship with, that he was looking up ways to kill his wife. Now, in 2007, he had no notes of this. He testified he didn't have notes of this. He testified he didn't write anything down. He had no notes, any questions, or any details. In 2008, he found the notes. This is one of them. They don't say the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze, but that's what he remembers Mark told him. Why didn't Ed Klug come forward? He says it's because Mark was his boss. But Mark wasn't his boss in 2002 when he reached out to the police to tell them that Mark had used a computer. Ed Klug testified that when he called his wife at 2:34 a.m., he told her that Mark Jensen was talking about killing his wife. According to this note, and to his story, Dawn Cooper was present. Near the bottom, Mark unloaded on us. So what did Dawn Cooper say? She remembered sitting with Ed Klug and Mark Jensen in the hotel lobby after bar closing. She was going through a divorce and they were saying supportive things to her. She remembered Ed Klug leaving to call his wife. She said there was no conversation about harming wives. She said there was no conversation about anyone using a computer to look up ways to harm a wife. She was no longer working at Stifel in 2002 when Mark got charged in this case. She testified she got a call from Ed Klug, and he said nothing about any conversation in 1998. Dawn Cooper got contacted by the prosecutors in 2007, or by the investigation. And the way she was asked about it is consistent with what Ed Klug says, that she would have been present for that conversation. And she knows it never happened. She would have remembered that. Stacy Bauer, she worked in the Appleton office. She came here and made an assertion that she heard this from Ed Klug. She also acknowledged having read about Ed Klug's testimony. And remember this, what's on the screen? That's her written statement from August 10th of 2007, which says, quote, I have no knowledge of a conversation Mark had with Ed Klug in St. Louis regarding killing his wife, end quote. Ed Klug says that Mark was talking about a website called howtokillyourwife.com. In all the computer stuff that we've heard, have we heard anything about howtokillyourwife.com? Joan Wise was Ed Klug's longtime assistant. Do you remember that Ed Klug claimed he told all staff on the Monday after the conference about this conversation? Joan Wise says that never happened. She never heard anything about Mark Jensen from Ed Klug, except that Mark Jensen's wife had died and that she had committed suicide. That's what she heard from Ed Klug. Ed Klug never said that Mark Jensen talked about killing his wife. She gave us her opinion about Ed Klug's honesty. He's not a truthful person. Her knowledge about his reputation, you can't believe a word he says. He's an attention seeker. Ed Klug's testimony about his drunken night in 1998 is just not believable. Ed Klug is not believable. This issue of David Thompson, David Thompson acknowledged that prior to talking to Mark Jensen, he wrote a letter to his fiancée saying, it's time to help myself. And everything about David Thompson is consistent with this, that David Thompson came up with a proposal, a crazy proposal, that somebody would be held for 6 weeks for $1,000. That he communicated that proposal to Martin. It's also very clear that no money ever exchanged hands. Now, you heard some phone calls. You heard some recorded phone calls between Mark and his parents. And the one that I had played, the call that I had played, predated the ones that he was calling, where it was a three-way call with David Thompson. And you can hear the intimidation in Mark's voice. And he's talking about, I need you to do this or I'm going to have a fight on my hands. You heard that advice from Nathaniel Clanton. Nathaniel Clanton said, this would be the dumbest thing you've ever done, or something like that. And he said, beat your case fair and square. It seems like Mark took that advice because no money ever changed hands. There's this sort of peripheral theory that's been floating around this trial that in November of 1998, Mark Jensen tried to kill Julie Jensen with ethylene glycol. And the only reason that this exists is because of Aaron Dillard. Now, we know that Julie Jensen threw up all over the carpet and didn't clean it up. And we've heard all about what ethylene glycol poisoning is. You hear really about it from the state's witness. Like I mentioned earlier, no toxicologist. Their experts were Dr. Chambliss, who didn't review things, and then Dr. Mand. But here's what's interesting about this claim, is Julie Jensen was at home with the kids. And with all the conversations and reports to the neighbors, the Voights, and with all the phone calls to Dr. Borman when there was the slightest sickness in that household, and with the statements about the paranoid statements about being poisoned or being drugged or somebody's out to get me. There's nothing about this incident. There are no reports to Dr. Borman. There's no reports to the Voights. There's no report of breathing problems. There's no report of intoxication. There was no poisoning in November. I'd suggest that this vomit all over the carpet that wasn't cleaned up, that might be indicative of something else that was going on. Julie Jensen used the computer and she used the internet. We know this from IT expert. She said that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. We know this from her statement. Jensen. This from the resume she created on the computer. There's this statement from Therese DeFazio that Julie Jensen said she didn't know how to turn on a computer. And then there's a little bit more of an explanation. And Therese DeFazio talked about clearing out the cache or checking the cache. And the clarification is that Therese DeFazio, at school, they had Macs. Could that have been why Julie Jensen didn't know how to turn on the computer at school? Because at home, they weren't on just their first computer, and they had IBMs. Now, set aside the problems with the investigation. The computer wasn't write-blocked when Detective Ratsberg insisted it be turned on, and the corruption of the files that can be caused by that. Now, the state said, when they looked through these different websites, they said, we know it was Mark on some days because the website was for Bass Pro Shops and for a cruise. They looked to context to say who would have been on these sites, who would have been looking at these pages. Julie's context is websites. This October 16th, the recipe link, a message board for cooking recipes, botulism. Who was the only one who did any cooking in the Jensen household? On October 16th, after 11 p.m., there's an ad Stifel branch listings. An email between Mark and Kelly Labonte from earlier that day. And then there's a search in Stifel for a Kelly, no last name. Mark Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was, and he knew how to email her and knew where she worked. Julie Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was. She knew of Kelly Labonte. This is the cover. This is the first page of Julie Jensen's day planner. And you see on the upper right corner, it says Kelly Labonte. And this lines up with what Ted Voigt said, that about 5-ish weeks before her death, that Julie Jensen knew that Mark was having an affair. The prosecution needs this to be Mark Jensen because there are searches for mercury fulminate in nicotine. The prosecution needs it to be Mark Jensen, or else it shows that Julie Jensen accessed the computer late at night. On November 10th, 1998, suicide message boards. A search for suicide, a search for physician-assisted suicide. I don't know why anyone clicks on different links after doing a search. I don't know how long Julie Jensen's page physician-assisted suicide, but there's only one person in that house that wasn't searching for suicide with what we know about the context of what was going on with Julie Jensen in those last couple of months. Look at the internet searches on December 2nd that Ms. McNeil showed you. 8:16 a.m. through 8:38 a.m. An article on ethylene glycol poisoning, oxalic acid, fomepizole, toxic alcohols, a page on how patients with toxic alcohols present, the dangers of ethanol substitutes, ethylene glycol, specific poisoning information. We heard about SSRIs from Dr. Hale, I think, and also Dr. West about the risk of certain medications and how they can ironically increase somebody's risk at suicide. The prosecution needs this to be Mark. But on December 2nd in the morning, Mark took Douglas to daycare. That was at 8 a.m. And then he went to Dr. Borman's. And after meeting with Dr. Borman, a prescription was written, and Mark Jensen took that prescription to Walgreens, where he waited for it to be filled. That was around 11:13 a.m. Ethylene glycol. It had to be Julie. On December 3rd, you have searches late at night and then in the morning. 9:40 a.m. toxic alcohols, ethylene glycol poisoning. a page on diabetic ketoacidosis. 9:42 p.m., 2 minutes later, back to the Yahoo search results for ethylene glycol poisoning. I think it was the state's first two witnesses in this case, Ruth Vorwald and Shannon Krause. 9:30-ish, they saw Mark driving. He wasn't at home. These had to be Julie. Mark had gone to pick up a check from a client. Then later he said that he stopped in the office. Now, Detective Ratsburg waited over 3 years to interview anyone at the office. And 3 years later, after Mark had been charged, they said they didn't see him that day. Well, the police searched all of Mark's property. They searched his briefcase, they searched his office. The check that he picked up from the client wasn't at the house. This is the problem with memory. It's the problem with waiting years to talk to people. Now, we know from Dr. Hale about the late stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. There is no scientific reason they would have been unable to go to the office and do a basic internet search. We know her body was producing urine. There's no was able to get from David Jensen his name and spoke with him that morning. You know what's interesting is there are no searches on this computer for Ambien, Paxil, Librium, there's paroxetine, Librium, Benadryl. No searches for divorce, right? That point's been made. Even though we know Julie Jensen was planning on getting a divorce. We heard that yesterday, that after the holidays, she'd be getting a divorce. Nothing like ethylene glycol or poisons or drug interactions were ever found on Mark's work computer. And this claim that he fried that computer is nonsense. They recovered that computer and they analyzed it. So who was Julie Jensen? We heard from witnesses that Julie Jensen was a lovely human being. We heard from witnesses that she was a devoted mother. We have no reason to doubt either of those characteristics. But you can be lovely and you can be devoted to your kids and you can be mentally ill. And Julie Jensen was mentally ill. She had a major depressive disorder and was at high risk of suicide. Sometimes it's hard to put a finger on what we're supposed to believe of Julie Jensen. Was she meek and vulnerable? Did she need Mark's permission to discuss their kids' medical issues with a doctor? Was she constantly under the thumb of her husband, being controlled by whatever he wanted? Was she so naive that in 1998 on their second home computer that she didn't know how to turn one on? She needed Mark to explain to her why she was feeling intoxicated on December 2nd. It sure doesn't seem that way. She was a straight A student. Chemistry, human physiology, death and dying, pharmacology, psych abnormal behavior, genetics. Those transcripts were admitted into evidence. She had her Series 7 brokerage license. She created a resume. After she had her own affair in the Jensen home, in the house, she was the one who sent Perry Trika packing and told him never to protect her anymore. That's not meek. We heard about her counseling in 1990 to 1991 with Paul DeFazio. She decided she wasn't happy with the progress. It wasn't going fast enough. And so she called and said she was going a different direction. That's not meek. When she fell in love with Perry Tarika, she got a lawyer and filed for divorce. She was in charge of the family finances. You've heard how she used Quicken on the computer. Her best friend, Laura Koster, the IT specialist. Laura Koster looked to her for how to use Quicken. Laura Koster confirmed that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. When the private investigator, Dave Ellis, when he told her that the photos left at the house weren't her, she told him he was wrong. And she told him she didn't want his services anymore. When Perry Tarika sent her a letter with clipped out articles and cartoons, Julie Jensen called the police on him. Julie Jensen made decisions for herself. Now, the prosecution has advanced this theory that Julie Jensen was made to believe she'd lose the kids if they got divorced. I don't know where that claim comes from. She had a lawyer when she filed for divorce in 1991. She asked for full custody in that filing. According to Jill Polera, she was about to file for divorce again. Laura Koster said Julie didn't need Mark's permission and didn't need Mark to tell her what to do. Laura Koster would go to Julie Jensen with medical questions. But Julie Jensen did have some serious, long-standing mental health problems. And here is where I think photos and the phone calls are actually relevant. We know that on June 29th, 1990, Mr. DeFazio, the psychotherapist, met with Julie Jensen. She had a son and married for 6 years. He identified the possibility of limited postpartum depression. She described her mom's problem with alcoholism and said that there was a family history of depression. Mr. DeFazio said Julie Jensen experiencing some serious health. He diagnosed her as adult emotional reactive with mixed features. He noted features of depression and anxiety. She told him she had a very unhappy childhood and was not happy whatsoever. In July 1995, getting little support from her spouse at home. In September of 1990, seasonal depression was noted. 2 weeks after that, they discussed an antidepressant and he referred her to a psychiatrist. She was prescribed Prozac. The psychiatrist, Dr. Newman, described crying all the time, having no appetite. She used to enjoy, and now it's just a chore. These are the notes. Chronically depressed, cries easily. Mr. DeFazio explained that with depression, things that used to give pleasure just don't anymore. Now, I mentioned in June of 1991, Julie Jensen canceled and said she wanted a different therapist, that progress wasn't going fast enough. She never told Mr. DeFazio about the affair. Mr. DeFazio made no referrals and did not know if she saw anyone else. Now, throughout this time are the hang-up calls and the issues with photos left at the house. I don't know what to make of the hang-up calls. Her log lists a lot of them. There's this narrative from the prosecution that it was Mark and that when there'd be a trace, the calls would stop. We've heard that. It's false. We looked at the logs. We went through this. The vast majority of the hang-up calls were out of area. And in the 90s, I guess they couldn't trace those. The calls kept coming in while the traces were in effect. We've seen that in the logs. I went through those with Detective Ratsburg. Detective Ratsburg testified that out of area meant out of state. Mark's work phone was a 262 area code. The prosecution's argument that Mark was gaslighting Julie with hang-up calls, we know that because of the traces, is just simply false. The less than thorough investigation of Perry Tarika as being the source of the calls, they called and asked him and he said it wasn't him. Were these just normal hang-up calls? If they were, was this just more paranoia and perceived harassment? So what about these photos? Perhaps we can consider what evidence there actually is about these photos. What was actually described in all of those police reports to the House. The reported leaving of photos was sporadic. And Julie Jensen was convinced it was her in the photos. What Detective Ratsburg wrote, when I spoke with Julie last, she told me that she and Mark had sexual problems, and she stated that the photos, which normally showed her having contact with a man's penis, is something Mark wanted to do, but she refused. The photos were described as showing her. They were described by Julie Jensen as showing her. Julie Jensen was a smart person and presumably would know if these pictures were of her. Now, despite testimony that there was a bag of evidence turned over and all the photos, all that was retained was a single photograph that by its description was unlike any of the others. This one was on actual photo paper. It had, I think, like a Kodak stamp on the back, and the picture looked nothing like Julie Jensen. Maybe the other ones didn't look anything like Julie Jensen, but the other ones were described as being on copy paper. These were never fingerprinted, although Detective Ratsburg acknowledged that they could have been. We heard from the secretaries that worked with Mark in 1998. They denied opening any mail that had pornographic pictures. But Detective Ratsburg confirmed that the only claims about getting photos in the mail at work were in the early 90s. Here's what else we know. They were all destroyed. So these pictures that Mark is accused of leaving around and sadistically torturing Julie Jensen with, there's no evidence for us to look at. Now, Mr. Jambo asked Dr. West yesterday. He asked her this question. If Julie Jensen knew that she was being sadistically, psychologically tortured by Mark Jensen, would that suggest that her perceptions of reality in her stated fears were not distorted? First, Julie Jensen denied everyone's suggestions that it might be Mark leaving the photos. She fired Dave Ellis, the investigator, when he made that suggestion. She insisted to Officer Kosman that they were her. So, if it was truly obvious that these pictures weren't of her, what does that say about her mental state that she just insisted that they were? Now, the next doctor reports that we have are Dr. Borman's. And he was her doctor from the mid-90s until Julie Jensen died. And she called about so many things. She called when Mark Jensen had walkable marker on his face. She called if there was a cough in the family. You heard us go through these records. But in September of 1998, at that appointment, she brought up the family history of depression. She was concerned about her mom's history. She was tired. She had been prescribed Prozac before. Dr. Borman diagnosed her as having mild depression. At that visit, she weighed 123.5 pounds. In the fall, Laura Koster was talking with Julie Jensen outside while the kids played around them. And Julie showed Laura a photo of a list and a plastic syringe and asked her what she thought. And to Laura Koster, the person who knew her best and was her best friend, nothing seemed odd about what she was being shown. But what she noticed from this was the unsureness and the oddness of the question. And then Julie, while the kids were playing around them in the driveway, mentioned she thought Mark was going to kill her. And Laura Koster told her she didn't see it at all and was absolutely stunned by the suggestion. But she said, if you feel you're in danger, come with me and we'll make sure you're safe. Laura Koster knew Julie Jensen better than anyone, and she said that Julie Jensen wasn't scared. She said Julie Jensen, in that conversation, had extraordinarily flat emotion for the topic of that conversation. You heard about on November 29th, there's a search for antifreeze. And then on November 30th, Julie was at karate practice and talked with Laura Koster again. This is the week that Douglas was starting full-time daycare. And Julie said she'd be going to see a doctor and be treated for depression. That she was going to see a doctor that week and be treated for depression. And she said she wasn't going to be at karate for the next few days or at the time. She said Laura wouldn't be seeing her for a few days. Laura described her as unusually emotive, that Julie Jensen hugged her and it was like a goodbye. And then Dr. Borman saw her on December 1st, 1998. He fit her in. She was alone at that appointment. Dr. Borman explained, really didn't want to be labeled as crazy. She was miserable. She was depressed. She had decreased appetite. She had lost nearly 7% of her body weight from the previous visit. She denied any issues of domestic violence. She was distraught and in tears. She declined counseling. She denied being suicidal. She denied being homicidal. Dr. Borman had never seen her like this. On December 2nd, Mark Jensen came and expressed his concern about Julie's sleep issues, and Dr. Borman gave him a prescription for some Ambien. Now, the prosecution seems incredulous that Dr. West thought that the prescription of Ambien was not based solely on the word of Mark Jensen. She opined it was necessarily filtered through the information from Julie Jensen the day before and previous visits which suggested major depression. I mean, we can look to the September visit where being tired Fatigue was noted. I want to talk about Julie Jensen's perceptions of reality. And I want to consider the wildly inconsistent statements of her. To Therese DeFazio, Mark wouldn't let her get a job. He was controlling. To the Voights, Mark is pushing her to get a job, and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she has to get a job because her marriage is in the toilet. To Laura Shore, she was actually offered a job and had a start date when she hadn't been offered a job and didn't have a start date. To Therese DeFazio, Mark always turned off the computer or covered it quickly. To the Voights, she'd walk past the computer screen and see poison on the screen. Mark would leave for work, and on the computer screen was a website for poison. I mean, I want to go through all of these, but on that one, like, we heard about dial-up internet, and we heard about when these searches were. And so was the computer just logged on onto this website for hours? Think about the computer. To Therese DeFazio, she wanted to put Douglas in a school for kids' needs. To the Voights, Mark is making her put Douglas in daycare and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she was upset and crying about needing to put Douglas in daycare full time and wanted to know if they had space. All of these statements are basically contemporaneous with each other. Well, picture of it. In the moment, the people that she showed it to, the people that knew Julie Jensen, who knew the context, who knew what her complaints and concerns were, they looked at that Post-it note, and how did they react? They thought it meant nothing. Some of Ted Voight's testimony in this case. Evidently, he thought that Mark Jensen had killed Julie Jensen. And then when he was asked to describe that office, he didn't recognize it. I don't know if you remember this from when he had been in that office. Later, things had been moved around. He was in that office after Julie Jensen had died, sitting there with Mark while Mark was helping him with stocks. So this neighbor who thinks that Mark Jensen was out to get Julie Jensen is then over there getting stock trading help from Mark Jensen in that office. You know, the thing about that, you know, leaving the computer on so that when Julie would be vacuuming or walk by and she would see what was on and the door would be 3/4 closed. We saw a picture of that room, and we talked about this. I think it was when we were testifying about the scene photos. And we saw a picture of the room and the location computer and where the door was and how the door closed. And if that door was 3/4 closed, no one would be able to see the computer screen. That list, that Post-it note, that's such a big deal. It says Fazio, Terry on it. Well, how does that play? How does Therese DeFazio play into this scheme of Mark Jensen's? It said Nicotrol. Didn't the state say that that was prescribed to Mark? Like all the other lists that got talked about, and what does this mean? What do these letters mean? And then we learned from Dave Naring their stock symbols. And here we are 25 years later trying to assign meaning to these little nuggets of information. Of these nuggets of information, people who lived in that moment and knew her the best looked at it, and we know how they reacted to it. Received and declined. Ted Voigt offered to give Julie money and she could use his cabin, and Julie declined the offer. Therese DeFazio offered to set up Julie with a women's shelter. Julie declined and said her neighbor was working on getting her a place. But when that happened, she had already declined Ted Voigt's offer. Laura Koster offered to give Julie a place to stay with the boys and not allow Mark at the residence if Julie was actually concerned. She also said, your brother lives a couple of miles away. Take the checkbook and the boys and leave. Julie didn't call her brother. She didn't leave with the boys. She didn't take the money. She had her own car. Officer Costman said, if this is real, go to the shelter if your life is in danger. She declined. You know, the state's wrong. We aren't suggesting that Julie Jensen was framing Mark Jensen with these statements about fear. These were paranoid misperceptions of reality. One of the things that Dr. West explained to us yesterday is she said that a person at high risk of suicide creates space for themselves to be able to follow through. She said she sees that in suicide cases. Julie Jensen created that space for herself. Her conversation with her best friend, Laura Koster, on November 30th. You're not going to see me for a few days. On December 2nd, she wrote the note to Therese DeFazio that she wouldn't be seeing her. Her conversation with Margaret Voigt on December 2nd. You won't be seeing me. Don't worry, I'm fine. I want to take a look at the last 2 weeks of her December calendar. Well, actually, if you go back, these are some calendar pages in November. And they're full of things. And then when we go to some pages, Julie Jensen was aware of what she was doing. She was creating space for herself, like Dr. described. On how ethylene glycol poisoning works from the prosecution. We learned that from Dr. Hale. And the blood levels tell us nothing about whether something is a homicide or a suicide. Dr. Mainland thought it's a homicide because it's hard to get someone to drink a fatal dose, and so it would have to be multiple lower doses. But then we learned that this little NyQuil shot was all that would be needed for it to be a fatal dose. And then there's nothing in Julie Jensen's toxicology that suggests this was anything more than a single fatal dose on the night of December 1st to the early morning of December 2nd. Now, the person educated in pharmacology who Laura Koster went to with questions about medicine, she didn't need Mark to explain side effects of Paxil or paroxetine. We learned about a person's mental faculties and their abilities while processing ethylene glycol. We learned about what Julie Jensen, the person educated in pharmacology, informed her neighbor on December 2nd that she was fine, it was her new meds, and Mark was going to the doctor for her. She knew that Mark Jensen was going to Dr. Borman's for her. Now that doesn't really fit with this idea that he's got this scheme and he's involuntarily administering medications and she doesn't know what they're for, and he's forcing her to take these things and he's drugging her against her will. We learned about the high likelihood that the half a teaspoon remnant of ethylene glycol in her stomach was just that, a remnant of a prior dose. We also heard from Dr. Mainland's extraordinary, but the blood levels tell you nothing. But you know what was interesting about her study is that almost every ethylene glycol case that she could find was a suicide. That's sad, and it's what happened here. Mark Jensen did not kill his wife. We know this from the science. We know this from what Julie Jensen told her physician. We know this from what Julie Jensen said goodbye to Laura Koster. We know this from the description of David Jensen and how distraught and grief-stricken his dad was. Now, the prosecution has one more chance to get up for an argument. They'll have their rebuttal argument. I'm not going to have a chance to answer that. So this will be the last you hear from me in this case. Please think about the questions we've asked of the witnesses in this case. Please think about what my answer would be to the state's argument. This case is tragic on so many levels. There's depression, suicide, and there's an innocent man on trial for homicide. Mark Jensen is innocent, and we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we still have the rebuttal, but take your break. How about 1:45? Is that good? All right. Please don't talk about the case. We'll see you back at 1:45.
Wow. If Jen is still there, I need to ask, a lot of us crafters have depression and anxiety, but I don't know that I have ever had paranoid misperceptions of reality. Is that a thing with depression? I've never felt paranoid with my depression. I don't know. Paranoid I don't get that. And he never explained why his client didn't call or 911 or take her to the hospital when she was having trouble breathing. Sat there hoping she'd get better. The kids said, "Dad, call the ambulance." You didn't do it. That's the biggest thing with me, and this whole thing, like, everybody's wrong, I'm right, everybody's lying, I'm not lying. I don't get it. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. That's just me. All right, here's what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen. I am going to end the live. I will do a part 2. We will start that at 1:45 Central Time. I think they're in the same time zone. It's 12:30 there, so we gave them till 1:40. So an hour and 15 minutes from now. Look for part 2, and I hope to see you back for part 2. It's going to be prosecution's rebuttal. I think it's going to be Attorney Jamboyce, the male. That's he's so passionate about this case that he's come out of retirement to prosecute it. Basically. They've hired him on as a special prosecutor just because he was the original prosecutor in this case and knows it that well. So I am so interested to hear this. I will see you guys at 1:45. Have a great lunch, everybody. Bye.